The receptionist barely glanced at the woman before shaking her head. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked," she said, her tone dismissive. The woman's simple dress and quiet demeanor didn't match the luxury of the five-star hotel. She didn't argue, didn't beg, just nodded and left. The staff chuckled, thinking they had turned away just another nobody. But minutes later, the doors swung open again, this time with a man whose presence made the entire lobby fall silent. The manager's face drained of color. Because the man wasn't just anyone. And now, he was here to set things right. The woman stepped into the grand lobby, her eyes scanning the towering chandeliers and polished marble floors. She moved with quiet confidence, though her attire, a simple beige dress and a modest handbag, contrasted with the luxury around her. She approached the front desk, where a blonde receptionist, Samantha, was idly scrolling through her phone. Samantha barely glanced up before offering a forced smile. "Welcome to Rosewood Grand Hotel. How may I assist you?" The woman returned a polite smile. "I'd like to book a room, please." Samantha's smile stiffened as she took in the woman's appearance. "I'm sorry, but we're fully booked." The woman's brow furrowed slightly. "That's strange. I checked online before coming, and it showed availability." Samantha's fingers tapped against the desk impatiently. "Our system updates constantly. Unfortunately, there are no rooms left." For a brief moment, the woman studied her, then gave a slight nod. "I see. Thank you for your time." She turned and walked toward the exit. Samantha let out a quiet scoff. "She really thought she could stay here," she whispered to her colleague. The automatic doors of the Rosewood Grand Hotel slid open, revealing a woman who seemed out of place in such a lavish setting. She stepped inside, her simple beige dress falling just below her knees, her hair neatly tied back, and a modest leather handbag resting on her shoulder. She walked with quiet grace, her eyes scanning the opulent interior. A grand chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a golden glow over the polished marble floors, where guests in designer suits and elegant evening gowns strolled past. As she approached the reception desk, a blonde receptionist named Samantha sat behind the counter, idly scrolling through her phone. The woman waited patiently for her attention, standing tall despite the curious glances she received from other guests. Finally, Samantha looked up, flashing a forced smile. "Welcome to the Rosewood Grand Hotel. How may I assist you?" she asked, her voice dripping with insincere politeness. The woman returned the smile, unbothered. "I'd like to book a room, please." Samantha's eyes flicked over the woman's attire, her expression faltering for a brief second before she regained her polished demeanor. "I'm afraid we're fully booked for the evening." The woman's brow furrowed slightly. "That's odd. I checked online before coming here, and it showed availability." Samantha let out a barely perceptible sigh, tapping a few keys on her keyboard. "Our system updates frequently. Unfortunately, all our suites have been taken." For a moment, the woman studied her, her sharp eyes picking up the subtle disinterest in Samantha's tone. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. Samantha's lips curled into a polite but dismissive smile. "Quite sure, ma'am. Perhaps you could try a hotel more suited to your preferences." There was a pause. The woman took in the receptionist's condescending tone, the way she barely concealed her judgment. Yet, instead of arguing, she simply nodded. "I see. Thank you for your time." Turning gracefully, she walked toward the exit, her posture unshaken. Behind her, Samantha leaned toward a fellow receptionist and whispered, "She really thought she could stay here?" The two giggled, returning to their phones. None of them had any idea what was about to happen next. The woman exited the Grand Hotel lobby without a word, her expression unreadable. She didn't rush or show the slightest hint of anger, but there was a quiet confidence in the way she carried herself, as if she knew something they didn't. The moment she stepped outside, she reached into her handbag, pulling out her phone with practiced ease. She dialed a number, the line ringing only once before a deep, authoritative voice answered. "Yes, darling." A small smile touched her lips. "I just had an interesting experience at the Rosewood Grand." There was a pause on the other end. "Interesting how?" She glanced back at the grand entrance, where the two receptionists continued their whispered conversation, laughing as they exchanged glances in her direction. "They refused to let me book a room," she said simply. "Said they were fully booked, even though I checked online and saw availability." The voice on the other end grew noticeably colder. "Who exactly told you that?" She turned away from the building, stepping toward the curb as the evening air swirled around her. A young woman at the front desk. Blonde, designer dress, attitude sharper than her manicure. There was a low chuckle on the other end. "I see. And did she recognize you?" The woman smirked slightly. "Not at all. Which makes this even more amusing." There was a beat of silence before the voice responded with calm authority. "Wait there. I'll handle it." Without another word, the call ended. She slipped her phone back into her bag and took a deep breath, her expression still serene. She wasn't worried. In fact, she was intrigued to see what would happen next. Inside the hotel, Samantha was still chatting idly with her colleague, completely unaware of the storm she had just invited into her world. The guests continued to come and go, their expensive shoes clicking against the polished floors, unaware that something big was about to unfold. And it was only a matter of time before the entire hotel learned exactly who they had just turned away. The air outside the Rosewood Grand had an unusual stillness, as if the universe itself was holding its breath. The woman stood calmly by the curb, adjusting the delicate strap of her handbag, her expression giving nothing away. She had been in situations like this before, underestimated, overlooked, dismissed. But what people always failed to realize was that she never played the game alone. Inside the lobby, Samantha barely spared another thought for the woman she had just turned away. To her, it was just another unimportant guest who didn't fit the standard of clientele they aimed to attract. She leaned against the reception desk, scrolling through her phone while casually gossiping with her colleague, a smug satisfaction on her face. Then it happened. A sleek black Rolls-Royce Phantom glided to a stop right in front of the hotel entrance, its presence alone enough to command attention. The chauffeur stepped out first, a man in a crisp, tailored suit who moved with military precision. Without hesitation, he walked to the rear passenger door, his white-gloved hand gripping the handle with a level of reverence usually reserved for royalty. The moment the door swung open, the atmosphere in the lobby shifted. Conversations quieted. A few guests turned their heads. The hotel staff, trained to recognize wealth and influence, instinctively straightened their postures. And then he stepped out. Tall, commanding, and exuding an effortless authority, the man adjusted the cufflinks on his $1,000 suit before taking a slow, measured glance around. His sharp gaze flickered over the hotel's name above the entrance, as if evaluating whether the establishment was even worthy of his time. Samantha's breath hitched slightly, a strange tension settling in her chest. The man was no ordinary guest. The way the doormen scrambled to greet him, the way a few guests murmured his name, it was clear that he was someone of immense significance. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Who was he? And why did it feel like he was here for a reason far beyond a casual stay? Then, before she could even process the weight of the moment, the woman she had dismissed earlier stepped forward. But this time, She wasn't just another guest. She was walking toward him. Without hesitation, the man's eyes softened as they met hers, and then, in a gesture that made the entire lobby collectively hold their breath, he placed a hand on the small of her back. A silent claim. A declaration. The realization struck Samantha like a slap. This woman, this simple, unassuming woman, wasn't just another guest. She was his wife. Silence fell over the lobby like a heavy curtain, thick with tension and unspoken regret. Every eye in the room was now fixed on the man and the woman, their presence alone altering the very atmosphere of the space. Samantha felt the blood drain from her face as reality crashed into her like a tidal wave. She had dismissed this woman, his wife, as if she were nothing. And now, standing before her was a man who exuded the kind of power that could either build an empire or bring one to its knees. A hushed murmur rippled through the staff. Even the hotel's general manager, a man who had spent decades catering to billionaires and dignitaries, looked uneasy as he approached, his posture stiff with nervous energy. He clearly recognized the man, and feared him. "Mr. Harrington," the general manager stammered, his usual confidence evaporating. "It's an honor to have you here, sir. Please, allow me to personally escort you and your wife inside." Samantha's stomach twisted into a painful knot. Harrington, as in Elliot Harrington, the self-made billionaire whose name alone could open doors that others didn't even know existed? The man whose influence stretched across industries, whose mere presence at an establishment was enough to elevate its status overnight. She had just turned away his wife. The woman stood poised, unreadable, her elegance only more pronounced now that the truth had been laid bare. She hadn't uttered a single word in retaliation, hadn't demanded an apology, yet Samantha felt smaller than ever beneath her quiet gaze. Elliot, however, remained silent for a moment, his sharp, calculating eyes flickering toward Samantha with an unreadable expression. He wasn't the type to raise his voice. No, men like him didn't need to. Their power was in their presence, in the unspoken consequences of their disapproval. And right now, Samantha knew, she had made a fatal mistake. The general manager shot her a glare, silently demanding an explanation, but what could she possibly say? That she had taken one look at this woman and decided she didn't belong? That she had based her judgment not on facts but on assumptions? Elliot finally spoke, his voice smooth yet laced with something cold beneath its surface. "My wife and I had a reservation," he said, slipping his hand protectively around his wife's waist. "But it seems your staff has a selective way of handling guests." The words were polite, but the meaning behind them was razor-sharp. The general manager paled. "Mr. Harrington, I assure you this is a terrible misunderstanding." "A misunderstanding?" Elliot raised an eyebrow, glancing briefly at his wife. "It didn't seem like a misunderstanding when my wife was being dismissed at the front desk, was it?" Samantha opened her mouth to speak, to justify, to beg, but nothing came out. Because there was no justification. And then, Elliot did something that sent another wave of unease through the room. He reached into his jacket, pulled out his phone, and calmly began typing a message. It was a simple action, but for a man of his stature, it was terrifying. Because people like Elliot Harrington didn't need to raise their voices or make a scene. They didn't threaten, they simply acted. And Samantha had a sinking feeling that her name was about to be attached to a very bad decision. A suffocating silence gripped the lobby, pressing down on Samantha's chest like an unbearable weight. Her heart pounded violently as she watched Elliot Harrington type effortlessly on his phone, his expression unreadable, his demeanor calm yet lethal. Every passing second felt like an eternity, each keystroke a slow, deliberate execution of her fate. The general manager, now visibly sweating, took a cautious step closer, trying to salvage the moment before irreversible damage was done. His hands twitched slightly at his sides, his mind likely scrambling for a solution, but the weight of the situation was far beyond his control now. "Mr. Harrington," he started, his voice shaky yet desperate to maintain professionalism, "please allow me to make this right. There's clearly been an unfortunate mistake." Elliot's fingers paused over his phone screen. He exhaled softly, almost disappointed rather than angry. His gaze flicked toward his wife, who stood beside him with the same quiet grace she had maintained throughout the ordeal. Not once had she raised her voice. Not once had she demanded justice. And yet, the mere revelation of who she was had sent the entire staff into a tailspin of panic. He finally lowered his phone, slipping it back into his jacket with a slow, deliberate motion. The air in the room remained thick with unspoken consequences, but his silence was even more unnerving. Samantha, frozen in place, felt a tightness coil in her stomach. The reality of what she had done was crashing over her like a relentless tide, dragging her deeper and deeper into a pit of regret. "I don't believe in mistakes," Elliot said finally, his voice smooth, controlled. "I believe in choices." His words cut through the air like a blade, slicing through whatever weak defense the general manager had been preparing. Samantha swallowed hard. He was right. This hadn't been an accident. She had made a choice. A choice to judge. A choice to dismiss. A choice to assume. And now, she was standing at the edge of the consequences. Elliot turned his gaze back to her, studying her carefully as if assessing whether she even deserved to be standing in front of him. The weight of his stare made her knees feel weak. "You saw my wife," he continued, his tone never rising above a controlled calm, "and you made a decision about her worth." Samantha's lips parted slightly, a breath catching in her throat. She wanted to protest, to plead ignorance, but she couldn't. She had done exactly that. Elliot took a step forward, his towering presence making the space between them shrink until she felt trapped in the gravity of her mistake. "Tell me something," he asked, tilting his head slightly. "If I hadn't walked through those doors just now, if I were just another businessman caught up in meetings, what would have happened to my wife?" Samantha's mouth went dry. She couldn't answer, because she knew the truth. Nothing would have changed. She would have let the woman walk away, humiliated. She would have continued her shift as if nothing had happened. Elliot's eyes darkened slightly, but there was no satisfaction in watching her squirm. No pleasure in seeing her panic. Because he wasn't seeking revenge, he was delivering a lesson. And Samantha was quickly realizing that some lessons cost more than others. The general manager, sensing the inevitable fallout, cleared his throat and forced an uneasy smile. "Mr. Harrington, we sincerely apologize for this oversight. It does not reflect our standards, and I can personally assure you." Elliot held up a hand, stopping him mid-sentence. "Don't tell me about your standards," he said coolly. "Show me." The room fell into stunned silence. The weight of his words wasn't just about this moment. It was about the culture that allowed this to happen in the first place. It was about the unchecked biases, the unspoken rules that determined who was worthy of good service and who wasn't. And Elliot was making it very clear that he wasn't interested in empty words. The general manager swallowed nervously. "Of course, Mr. Harrington. Please allow us to offer you and your wife our presidential suite on the house. Complimentary services, anything you require." But Elliot merely raised an eyebrow, almost amused. "You think free perks erase poor judgment?" Samantha flinched. The power balance had shifted entirely, and there was no going back. Elliot took his wife's hand, his touch gentle yet protective, and turned toward the exit. "We won't be staying," he said simply. A simple sentence, yet devastating in its implications. Because Elliot Harrington didn't just represent one guest. He represented a standard, a reputation, an influence. And this five-star hotel had just lost more than a booking. It had lost something far more valuable. A suffocating silence settled over the opulent lobby, thick and unyielding, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. The pristine marble floors gleamed under the chandelier's golden glow, reflecting the rigid, frozen expressions of the staff who now stood motionless, caught between fear and regret. The general manager's polished demeanor was beginning to crack. His once confident stance had faltered, his fingers twitching at his sides, his breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The weight of the situation was pressing down on him like an avalanche, and no amount of corporate training could prepare him for the storm brewing before his eyes. His voice, once smooth and composed, now wavered. "Mr. Harrington, He cleared his throat, forcing a desperate smile, his professional mask slipping. "I assure you, this is not representative of our values. We take pride in our service and—" Elliot Harrington's piercing gaze cut through the man's words like a blade, sharp and unrelenting. There was no rage in his eyes, no dramatic outburst. Only power. A quiet, chilling dominance that made it clear this wasn't something that could be smoothed over with empty words and fake apologies. His wife, the woman who had been so casually dismissed, stood beside him with the same grace and quiet confidence she had carried from the beginning. She did not gloat. She did not smirk. She merely observed, her expression unreadable, while the manager practically sweated through his expensive suit. The employees, who had once whispered among themselves, now stood in agonizing silence. They understood. This was not just any guest. This was Elliot Harrington, a man whose presence alone dictated respect. Finally, Elliot spoke. His voice was low, measured, far more dangerous than if he had raised it. "You're right," he said simply. "This is not representative of your values." The manager's lips parted slightly, hopeful for a brief second. But then Elliot tilted his head slightly, his stare unwavering. "It's worse." The single sentence sent an icy ripple through the room. Samantha, the woman who had started this entire disaster, flinched. She had made one decision, one thoughtless, impulsive assumption, and now it was spiraling into something she could no longer control. "Sir, please," the manager pressed, his voice now almost pleading. "There must be something we can do. Perhaps a formal apology, a private conversation? Our presidential suite, of course, completely on the house. Full access to our VIP services, our most exclusive amenities." Elliot let out a quiet chuckle. It wasn't amused. "You think I'm here for a free room?" he asked, his tone light but laced with undeniable authority. "You think that's the problem?" The manager froze, realizing his mistake too late. No, of course not, sir. I only meant to." Elliot's expression didn't change. He let the silence stretch, forcing the man to sit in his discomfort, forcing him to understand. Because this wasn't about compensation. This wasn't about a meaningless, surface-level apology. This was about a standard that had already been broken. The weight of that realization settled into the manager's gut like lead. Elliot took a small step forward, closing the space between them ever so slightly. Not aggressive. Not hostile. Just deliberate. "Tell me something," Elliot said, his voice still maddeningly calm. "If I were just another businessman, if I hadn't walked through those doors today, what would have happened?" The manager's throat bobbed as he swallowed. "Sir, No," Elliot cut him off smoothly. "Don't lie to me." Samantha inhaled sharply, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Because she knew exactly where this was going. If Elliot hadn't arrived, if he hadn't been Elliot Harrington, nothing would have changed. Samantha wouldn't have thought twice about the woman she had dismissed. The staff wouldn't have rushed to intervene. And this moment, this crushing, career-ending moment, would have never come to pass. Elliot knew that. The manager knew that. Everyone in the room knew that. "You would have let my wife walk away, humiliated," Elliot continued, his voice barely above a whisper now. "And you would have carried on with your day, not thinking about it again." The truth was deafening. The manager's face paled. Elliot held his gaze for a long, excruciating moment before turning to his wife. His expression softened, but only slightly. His grip on her hand was gentle, reassuring, but his stance was still unshakable. He turned back to the manager. "We're leaving." A single sentence, yet devastating in its implications. Because Elliot Harrington wasn't just one guest. He was a name, a reputation, a powerful influence. And now, that influence had decided against them. The manager's breath hitched. "Sir, please, if you could reconsider." Elliot didn't respond. He didn't need to. With his wife beside him, he turned, walking toward the exit without a single glance back. And in that moment, the five-star hotel lost more than a booking. It lost something far more valuable. The automatic glass doors hissed open, and a gust of cool evening air swept into the lobby as Elliot and his wife walked out, their silhouettes disappearing into the city's golden twilight. For a moment, there was only silence, heavy, suffocating, and stretched so thin that it threatened to snap at any second. Then, chaos. The moment the doors slid shut behind them, the manager's composure shattered like glass. His stiff, corporate-trained posture crumpled, and his fingers gripped his temples as if trying to stop the impending disaster from crushing him whole. "Are you out of your mind?" he hissed, turning to Samantha, his expression no longer one of irritation, but raw, unfiltered panic. Samantha, the woman who had so confidently dismissed the guest just moments ago, now looked as if the floor had been ripped out from under her. Her perfectly applied lipstick was smudged where she had nervously bitten her lip, her manicured fingers trembling slightly as she clutched the hem of her blazer. I didn't know who he was," she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. The manager let out a humorless laugh, sharp, almost manic. "Oh, you didn't know." His voice dripped with sarcasm, his panic morphing into something far uglier. "Did you think he just looked important? You thought you could play gatekeeper and decide who deserves to be in our hotel?" Samantha's face burned with humiliation. Yes, that's exactly what she had thought. She had taken one look at the woman's simple dress, lack of designer labels, and modest demeanor and made a snap judgment, one that had now cost them everything. The other employees, who had stood frozen in stunned horror, exchanged nervous glances. No one spoke, but the fear in their eyes said it all. Everyone knew who Elliot Harrington was now. A billionaire investor. A hotel mogul with global influence. A man whose word could make or break an establishment like theirs. And now, his silence had spoken volumes. The manager turned on his heel, his mind racing. Damage control. There had to be a way to fix this. He lunged toward the front desk, yanking open the reservation system and searching for any direct contact information. His fingers flew across the keyboard, his breaths shallow and uneven. Nothing. Elliot hadn't booked under his name. He hadn't used his personal accounts. No direct phone number. No way to reach him. The panic clawing at his chest tightened. One of the senior concierges hesitated before stepping forward. Sir, should we call corporate? The manager snapped his gaze toward him, his expression twisting in frustration. Call corporate, he repeated, his voice dangerously close to breaking. And tell them what? That we just turned away the most influential man in the hospitality industry because my staff thought his wife wasn't rich enough to be here. The concierge swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. There was no fixing this. The damage had already been done. And worse, it was about to get a lot more public. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on the hotel staff like an iron grip, squeezing the air from their lungs. The lavish chandeliers overhead sparkled mockingly, their golden light casting long shadows across faces drained of color. The manager's breathing was ragged, his heartbeat thunderous in his ears. He spun toward Samantha, his expression livid. "You need to fix this," he snapped, his voice barely restrained. Samantha flinched. How? He's already gone. Then find a way. The manager's voice cracked, drawing the nervous eyes of the staff and a few lingering guests who pretended not to be eavesdropping. "You don't understand what you've done. If word of this gets out—" A sharp ding interrupted him. His stomach plummeted. Slowly, almost mechanically, he turned toward the front desk where the hotel's official email inbox blinked with an unread message. The sender's name hit him like a brick to the chest. Elliot Harrington. The entire lobby seemed to still as he clicked on it, his fingers numb. The subject line was brutally simple. A formal response to your hospitality. No one breathed as the manager's eyes darted across the screen, absorbing every syllable, his face shifting from pale to ashen. Samantha swallowed, her hands clenching into tight fists. What does it say?" The manager's jaw tightened, his Adam's apple bobbing as he forced himself to read the words out loud. "To the management of the Grand Royale. Tonight, my wife and I were given a first-hand experience of your establishment's definition of exclusivity. It appears that wealth, power, and influence are the only acceptable currencies for respect in your hotel. My wife, a woman whose grace and humility outshine every chandelier in your lobby, was treated with nothing short of contempt for the simple crime of not dressing to your staff's standards. A mistake. A very costly mistake. You see, I don't believe in second chances for those who judge without knowing. However, I do believe in ensuring that others never experience the same humiliation. I will be personally sharing our experience with my network, both professionally and publicly. I trust you understand what that means for your reputation. No need for a response. You've already said enough. Regards, Elliot Harrington." The moment he finished reading, the room erupted. Samantha let out a sharp, audible inhale, her nails digging into her palm. The staff murmured in hushed voices, eyes darting toward the manager for direction. The guests who had overheard quickly grabbed their phones, already typing. The manager stumbled back a step, dizzy. This was bad. Really bad. Elliot Harrington's influence stretched far beyond the hotel industry. If he spoke out publicly, the hotel's reputation wouldn't just take a hit, it would crumble. The internet would have a field day. And the worst part, it was too late to stop it. The manager slumped into the nearest chair, his mind spiraling as the reality of the situation sank in. Sweat beaded at his temples, and for the first time in his career, he felt truly powerless. Samantha was frozen in place, her pulse racing. "Sir, what do we do?" The manager clenched his jaw, inhaling sharply through his nose. "We get ahead of it." His voice was low, almost shaking. The staff stared at him, waiting. He shot up from his seat, eyes flicking around the lobby as if searching for a lifeline. There had to be a way to control the damage. "Find out if Mr. Harrington is still in the city," he barked, already striding toward the concierge desk. "If he hasn't left yet, we send him a personal apology. No, a face-to-face one. We offer him anything, a full refund, a week's stay in our presidential suite, a public statement, whatever it takes." The head concierge, a woman named Denise, gulped. "Sir, if he's already sent that email, do you think—" "I don't care." His voice rose sharply, making Samantha flinch. "We do something." Samantha hesitated. "And what about his wife?" The manager's jaw tightened. He had barely spared a thought for the woman who had been turned away, but now it was hauntingly clear. This wasn't just about Elliot Harrington's influence. It was about the insult. His wife had been humiliated. If they wanted any chance of salvaging this, she had to be the priority. Samantha seemed to read his thoughts. "We need to apologize to her directly. Not just a statement. She deserves a personal, heartfelt." The manager's phone buzzed violently in his pocket. He snatched it up, barely glancing at the screen before answering. "This is Richard." His voice was strained. A cold, authoritative voice greeted him on the other end. "Mr. Langley, this is Vincent Clark, from the board of directors. I assume you've read Mr. Harrington's email." The bottom dropped out of his stomach. "Yes, sir," he managed. Vincent's voice was calm, but lethal. "Then you understand how unacceptable this is. The Grand Royale's reputation is on the line. If this escalates further, I don't need to tell you what that means for your position." Richard felt faint. He gripped the desk for support. "We are expecting a full resolution immediately," Vincent continued. "Make this go away, Richard. Or we will." The line went dead. Samantha watched in horror as the manager slowly lowered the phone, his face ashen. "What did they say?" she whispered. His fingers trembled as he ran a hand down his face. "They said—" He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "Fix it, or I'm finished." The Grand Royale, once a symbol of exclusivity and prestige, now stood under the crushing weight of its own arrogance. The headlines were merciless. Social media was flooded with outrage, with thousands calling for boycotts. Former guests shared their own horror stories, and the hotel's rating plummeted overnight. Elliot Harrington's public statement had been the final nail in the coffin. He hadn't just condemned the hotel, he had exposed the culture within it. "This wasn't just about my wife. This was about the idea that some people are treated as less than based on appearance alone." The Grand Royale had a choice that night: hospitality or elitism. They chose wrong. And now the world knows. The board of directors didn't hesitate. Richard Langley was fired immediately. His decades in the industry meant nothing now. He had become a cautionary tale, a man who had let status blind him. As he packed up his office, he caught his reflection in the window. The city skyline stretched before him, a reminder of the world that had moved on without him. Samantha watched from the doorway, her face unreadable. "Where will you go?" she asked quietly. He let out a humorless laugh. "Someplace that still has room for people like me." But deep down, he already knew the truth. There wasn't one. And as he walked out of the Grand Royale for the last time, he realized he had been the one turned away in the end.